have planned what we're going to do next, but we will get there. We'll have it before next Sunday. But we are on chapter 26, Reach the Cities. And this was an interesting chapter. I will say I thought this one had a lot of interesting concepts, a lot of interesting thoughts in it. And a lot that makes me wonder, are we doing evangelism from not just a church standpoint, from a denominational and a national standpoint? Are we reaching where we should be reaching? The statement he quotes at the very beginning: Christianity was an urban movement in the New Testament, and it was set down by urbanites. That's by Rodney Stark. And then Tim Keller says the single most effective way for Christians to reach the U.S. would be for 25% of them to move to 2 or 3 of the largest cities and stay there for 3 generations. And then Acts 8:8, where it says there was great joy in that city. Acts 18:10, I have many people in the city. Hebrews 11:16, but they now aspire to a better land, a heavenly one, for he has prepared a city for them. So, the thought of, cities are very important in the Bible, and whenever we look at evangelization, it's an important thing when we think about, well, how do we evangelize? How do we move into that to win the lost and influence the world for the future? And one of the things he pointed out, and I had never really thought too much about this, he said there is a difference between the inner city and the city center. And we see some of that even happening now in Columbia as they're building up the areas right surrounding downtown, making it where those young urban professionals, we used to call them yuppies, the young urban professionals, the young professionals want to move into that area so they don't have to own a car. So they don't have to own, all of that expense of having a car. They live in an apartment where they can walk or take public transportation. You see that more and more in a lot of the larger arenas, the larger cities in the United States. As a matter of fact, he lists several charts, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but he lists several of them that show the largest cities, but then shows the largest city areas, and we find that they're different. Our largest cities aren't ones continuing to grow necessarily. Now, some of them are. I mean, you got your New York, you got your Dallas, Fort Worth, you've got your Los Angeles. Those are still growing and sprawling out into those areas, and there's lots of things going on there. But his statement, what he's really coming down to is the city is what influences society. When you look at the changes in our society in America, most of them have come out of that comes from the cities. If it happens in New York, eventually it's going to happen somewhere else. Goodness, now we have our own New Year's Eve party. And I remember growing up, the only party you ever saw on New Year's Eve was the one you watched on TV when they dropped the ball at Times Square. We see how what goes on in the city influences our society as a whole. Now, I know that we tend to think, and he brought this out, I think, pretty clearly, we tend to think, the whole gay and lesbian movement came out of, we want to say, San Francisco or San Diego or out in California. But he said Boston actually is more of an influence on the gay and lesbian movement than any of the other cities. As a matter of fact, and this is a scary thing that he found in his studies, in his statistical studies, well, not just statisticals. He had couples who had gone and tried to start evangelization in the Boston area, and they said from the time in Boston, from the time a child is in public kindergarten, the gay and lesbian influence is already being pushed on those children. Now, we say, well, that's in Boston. That's up north. That ain't going to happen here. Folks, if it's happening in the big city, eventually it's going to happen here. And so I understand where he says, if we as a denomination begin to put some effort, some focus on our mission sending to starting churches in larger cities, we may influence 3 generations from now. We're not going to influence this upcoming generation, but we need them there now. We might not even influence the next generation, but we need them there now, because by the 3rd generation, if we're not there now, by the 3rd generation, can you imagine how horrible it may be? And yet the majority of church starts in the Southern Baptist Convention are in suburban areas, not in the urban areas. They're out in the suburbs and the countryside, some of them. And whenever we do try to start churches in the urban areas, we send a missionary and his wife, and we say, all right, y'all go and get it started. We'll pay you a stipend, and y'all get it going. And they feel like they're out there on their own. And he suggests following how Paul, did his church starts. He would go to the city, but he always had a group with him. He had, 3 and 4 people coming with him to help him start that church plant. And he said, we need to begin thinking that way whenever we begin sending missionaries, when we begin pushing the mission effort, and begin thinking, well, how do we influence the world, the United States, to bring us back where we need to be? Well, we need to be putting missionaries in those areas, and not just a husband and wife, but a team, so that they can help lift each other up, so that they have a support group when they get there. Because a lot of these central city centers is full of evil. They just are. I mean, you've got people in there, and granted, I wish I could say this wasn't the case, but it is. I know I'm a technologist. That is the job. That's what I love. I enjoy it. I thoroughly do. I think that there's lots of good that comes out of technology. I think there's a lot good we can do with technology. But I do know that there are a lot of technologists who don't believe in God. There's a lot in the tech industry. We think that we are so smart, and too many of us think that we're smarter than God is. Well, the church has left that area completely alone, it seems like. And we wonder why those who influence society, who influence government, why we are in the state we're in, is because we've allowed those that influence those arenas to be the ones that don't know anything about God, because we haven't tried to evangelize at that level. We've instead tried to keep church starts out in the countryside where we're comfortable. And I'm gonna be honest, I feel like I am too old to move into something like that, but I do think we need to begin praying and pushing our convention and our association to look at these things, to think about these things, to decide how do we do home missions so that it's a better influence for society in the future. Because as he says in here, what happens in the city eventually moves out to the countryside. And so I think it is important for us to look at these cities and at these city areas and see how we can plant churches there that can eventually change the view of that world. One of the things he brings up, and I'd never thought about this, I never really, honestly, I don't think too much about California, but he had brought up the fact that I think it was in the 70s when there was the big earthquake that devastated San Francisco. He said prior to that earthquake, really everybody looked at San Francisco as the driving city in California, the one that really pushed new things and pushed society, pushed our younger generation. After that earthquake, though, because of people now being afraid, well, I'm not going to build in San Francisco. Look at what they just had happen. They claimed they were building for earthquake proof, and look, it didn't seem to help them at all. Los Angeles has now become that city. When you look at the trends in our young adults and our youth and what they wear, how they act, what they say, you can almost without a doubt trace it back to how it started in Los Angeles. And yet we're not sending missionaries to start churches there. I think that's where we, especially in the Southern Baptists, need to begin pushing our convention, pushing our denomination to think about these things, to begin worrying about not us, worry about the next generations. Worry about those that look like they're headed down the path to a devil's hell.
Methodist Church, I'm not sure where it was at. Ordained the first homosexual pastor.
Oh, no.
Even though the rules or whatever they got, bylaws say they don't approve of same-sex marriages. But they elect a gay woman bishop.
See, I think that's people trying to thinking that that's going to help them grow, and I don't either. I'm not sure. Yeah, and that's coming out of our cities, really, when you look at it. He talks here about major cities having a lot more in common with each other from nation to nation than the rural areas do. It gave the example of major cities he's been to, and every one of them he's been able to eat in a McDonald's, get a Starbucks coffee, and go to Hard Rock Cafe to eat supper. When we look at these major metropolis areas, there are so many similarities, and if we're able to reach into even one of them effectively, it has an influence on the others. And even if it's not a Southern Baptist church that starts something in one of the others, maybe it's another friendly denomination. That's another thing he brings up, that we in the Southern Baptist Convention have been too dead set on, if it's not invented here, then it's not worth anything. If it's not a Southern Baptist thing, it's not worth anything. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. We're all in the same battle. And we do have to, we don't want to join forces with a group that doesn't believe in Jesus Christ or doesn't believe, in the tenets of faith that we believe in. But there are so many that do. Why aren't we supporting each other through our missionary efforts? So that as we learn what another denomination is doing, why don't we learn from that? Why don't we grow from that? Why don't we share with them what we're doing? So that maybe the cultural influence will be there 2 to 3 generations from now. He talks about how cities are changing, about the way things have been done differently. How the inner city is still considered the place that's dangerous, that nobody wants to live in. But the city centers are becoming where people do want to live. He's talked about that several times in this chapter. He said, younger people, especially young unmarrieds, that is where they want to go. Because even though rent may be more expensive for the apartment, if they don't have to buy a car and pay the tax and tags and license on the car, and they don't have to deal with all that part, it may be cheaper for them to live there. Yeah, they don't have yard work, and they're near all the cultural events. They're near the art museums. They're near the different things that go on, the plays and the different entertainments areas that we have that build in those city centers quicker than they do out in the country. I have noticed myself, even here in the Columbia metro area, I'm finding, that it's almost like you're seeing less and less stores that want to be part of a mall than you do that want to be part of the Vista, because they see the Vista as being somewhere where those young urban professionals who are, getting out of college, and some are making big bucks, and they can go and buy stuff there, and they don't have to don't have to drive a car. Whereas at a mall, you've got to drive a car to get to a mall. The mall is going to focus more on, really now what I see them focusing more on is our age. Those of us who do want to go and, leisurely park somewhere and leisurely browse through the stores that we need to go to. But you don't see the stores wanting to move into the mall as much as you see them wanting to move into city centers. So there is it's almost like there's a change in how America even is approaching building out our infrastructure as a country. Whether we've done it deliberately or whether it's just the way it's happened, it seems to be the way it's happening. And he talks about the fact that most of us evangelicals have been fascinated with the suburbs instead of the city centers. He talks about, he remembers when he was a child, a trip across Birmingham to the zoo seemed like a forever long excursion. Then they built the interstate, and all of a sudden the zoo was closer. I remember when going downtown to go to, oh shoot, where was it? J.C. Penney's. When we would go get Easter clothes or school clothes, Mom's planned on us spending all day on Saturday because we had to go all the way downtown. And now to go downtown is, well, yeah, I'd rather not, but I can. It's not a big deal. We're 10 minutes away if you grab the interstate. We find that is one of the big changes we're seeing, is that people are deciding now, well, I don't want to have a car. I don't want to have to even go the 10 minutes in the car. I want to be right near where I am. It says in 2000, which is now 16 years ago, 80% of the people in the U.S. lived in metro areas. Only 50% of Southern Baptist churches were there. Now, that was 16 years ago. You can imagine today it's even more. So, that in itself tells me that, we're not able to reach. Maybe one of the reasons churches aren't growing in these areas is because there aren't the people living in these areas that there used to be, or they're not moving to these areas. There is a need for us to be evangelistic in those areas that we're not necessarily comfortable with. I would like to look and see, whenever we get to a certain point, if we do grow and get where I hope we get, where my plans are for us to get, not that we necessarily go and do something downtown or in the Vista or in that area, but I wouldn't mind helping another church sponsor something down there. I wouldn't mind providing support to that. As a matter of fact, I think that would be an exciting thing to provide support to. And then let them come and tell us how it's going, what they're doing. Get us excited here for what's going on there. And he talks some about that, about churches supporting that, because, you look at, goodness, a lot of the, especially older churches, they have no debt, they have no real, they have money in the bank. Why aren't they supporting sending these missionaries? And I think that we have somewhat in the Southern Baptist world have gotten so used to, well, I give to the convention. That's my support to the missionaries. Maybe sometimes that's good and that's bad. It's wonderful we can pool our resources, but sometimes I think we begin to sit back and say, well, I've already done what I need to do. Yeah, it's like the when I was growing up and someone came and knocked on the door and you said, I gave it the office. Have we gotten to that point where we say, well, I gave to the convention. I don't have to worry about missionaries. But in reality, today in the United States, I think we need more missionaries here than we ever needed before. Because we have kids growing up never knowing who Christ is, becoming the cultural leaders, never knowing what church is. And we need to begin determining how do we reach those people. And that's his whole goal in this chapter. I am not going to continue on with this chapter because I feel like we've beaten it pretty much to everything that it says. I did want to read to you his closing comments. And let me see if I can get there. Will be there. Here we go. This is the missional living realized, the conclusion. I have it on page, yeah, that sounds right. Missional living realized. He says, a few years ago, and I'm just going to read this because I think it's a good read. A few years ago, my family moved. When we first moved to Wake Forest in 1995, we built a house in a neighborhood populated mostly by seminary faculty. I do love my colleagues, but living in a Christian ghetto never quite fit us. So when we got a chance, we moved into the country to live on 7 acres with a swimming pool and beautiful trees. While there, we helped a neighbor become an active follower of Christ and plug into our church. But while we enjoyed the space, we missed the impact we could make. So we sold the place, moved back into Wake Forest, bought a house in a subdivision. On our street where we now live, there are about a dozen houses. Only one family on the street is originally from North Carolina. Our closest neighbors are from California, 2 families, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania. Most are from outside the South. Most are unchurched. We have a couple who live together, an interracial couple, and a variety of political and social views, not to mention religious ideas. We have seen God at work here. We've seen a few come to Christ, and some are active in our church now, but the work is slow. These are very successful people, several of whom own their own businesses. Most got enough conventional Christianity, usually of the mainline Protestant variety, to make them think they could do better without it. It had been quite a laboratory to help me think through how America must be reached. My family lives as missionaries in the community. We have shared Christ intentionally with most, if not all, and have spoken to neighbors on many occasions on spiritual issues. I believe more than ever the secret to reaching America is helping believers to live missionally in their communities, workplaces, and schools. We must keep the gospel ever before us. And then here's another story he tells, and I think it's another good one. It says, after a speech, an older man approached pro-life activist Penny Lee, weeping. He told her the following story. I lived in Germany during the Nazi Holocaust. I considered myself a Christian. I attended church since I was a small boy. We had heard the stories of what was happening to the Jews, but like most people today in this country, we tried to distance ourselves from the reality of what was really taking place. What could anyone do to stop it? A railroad track ran behind our small church, and each Sunday morning, when we would hear the whistle from a distance and then the clacking of the wheels moving over the track, we became disturbed when one Sunday we noticed cries coming from the train as it passed by. We grimly realized that the train was carrying Jews. They were like cattle in those cars. Week after week, that train whistle would blow. We would dread to hear the sound of those old wheels because we knew that the Jews would begin to cry out to us as they passed our church. It was so terribly disturbing. We could do nothing to help these poor, miserable people, yet their screams tormented us. We knew exactly at what time that whistle would blow, and we decided the only way to keep from being so disturbed by the cries was to start singing our hymns. By the time that train came rumbling past the churchyard, we were singing at the top of our voices. If some of the screams reached our ears, we just sang a little louder until we could hear them no more. Years have passed and no one talks about it much anymore, but I still hear that train whistle in my sleep. I can still hear them crying out for help. God forgive all of us who called ourselves Christians, yet did nothing to intervene. Now, so many years later, I see it happening all over again in America. God forgive you as Americans, for you have blocked out the screams of millions of your own children. The Holocaust is here. The response is the same as it was in my country: silence. While Lee applied this tragic story to the abortion Holocaust in America, it also speaks to the negligence of the church to seek to save lost souls from hell. May our generation not be so busy spending time in activities at the local church building that we miss the cries of the hurting. Tell someone about Jesus. Good conclusion. That is our call, to be missionaries, to be missional, to think about how do we share the gospel. That's my encouragement to us. And as we begin to move over the next months and year and a half is what I'm looking out now and trying to think through and plan through. Folks, I hope to see us hit our community differently than we've hit in the past. I think we are in a place where we can, and I'll be honest, I love our denomination. I have said before, unless the Southern Baptist Convention does something that totally drives me away from it, if they do something like decide the Bible's not the real inspired Word of God, or if they decide that they want to promote homosexuality or other sins that are blatantly mentioned in the Bible, I will probably die Southern Baptist. But I am not so bold as to say we don't need to minister with our brothers and sisters of other denominations. And I feel like that we have an opportunity here in South Congaree that we haven't had before. And I picture this next year and a half, us seeing a mighty move of God's hand in this place. And I want us to be ready to tell others, because I think the fields are going to be wide into harvest, ready for us to go and just start reaping. That's my prayer for the church. Like I said, I have not exactly planned where we're going to start next week.